Well, hello and welcome to another episode of Undercooled. Today we've got a guest, Dave Srolovitz, and we have a guest host, Professor Liz Holm. And you're going to find out there's a connection there. But Dave came all the way from Hong Kong just to be on our podcast. He's the Dean of Engineering at Hong Kong University. But of course, I know Dave from when we were both graduate students back at Penn, when we had to live in miserable circumstances and do whatever our advisors told us to do. So
or not.
Neither Dave nor I really ever listened to that advice, but we're really happy to have you here, Dave. So as we usually do, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got where you are? Maybe you can tell us all the places you've been as a faculty member. That's remarkable. And maybe also tell us, more importantly, how did you ever get into material science and engineering?
Good question. I'll start with how did I get into material science? So I was a physics undergraduate, and I was prepared to go to graduate school in physics after I finished. And I was talking to a friend of my father's who asked me what I'm going to do after college. And I told him, I'm going to go to graduate school in physics. He said, oh, what area of physics are you going into? And I said, condensed matter physics. And he said to me, oh, you should really look at material science. As a typical physicist, I gave the logical answer, I never heard of material science. What is that? And he says, well, it's kind of like solid state physics, except material scientists get jobs when they graduate. So that's how I got into material science. And you asked me all the places that I've been.
Right.
So after I finished my PhD at Penn, I worked for a few years at Exxon Corporate Research in a metallurgy group. Then that was sort of a postdoc. And after the postdoc, I went to Los Alamos National Laboratory, where I had an appointment in theoretical physics. After a few years there, my kids got old enough to go to school, so I figured I'd better bring them someplace where they can have a different kind of education. So I looked around, and I ended up right here at the University of Michigan. And that was a few years ago, and I've been here. I was here for 12 years, and it was a very defining part of my career. After I was at Michigan, I moved to Princeton University, and I was there for a number of years. I was director of the Princeton Institute for Materials for a few years, and then I was department head of mechanical and aerospace engineering. After that, I took a short detour. I was dean of General College at Yeshiva College in New York, and I did that for a few years until in 2000, what year was that? 2008, the economy sort of tanked, and my job became not much fun there. I was actually going to double the size of the faculty, but then I ended up just trying to hold the pieces together. And my friends at that point in Singapore called me and says, how would you like to come to Singapore? And I says, well, what do you want to do? What do you want me to do? And they actually gave me exactly the right answer. They says, well, what do you want to do? So I appreciated that answer. So I moved to Singapore, and I became the executive director of the Institute for Computational Engineering, Computational Science. And I did that for several years. Then I went back to the U.S., went to the University of Pennsylvania, back to where I was a graduate student. I sort of have this habit of returning home. So it's the homing pigeon instinct. And I was there for 6.5 years. And then I moved to Hong Kong. And I've been in Hong Kong now for 7 years. I'm currently Dean of Engineering at the University of Hong Kong. And I just became a permanent resident there. And so I'm enjoying my time in Hong Kong. And it's a privilege to be back here at the University of Michigan, where I spent a very formative part of my career. And I should mention also that my second PhD student was Elizabeth Holm, who happens to be sitting right next to me at the moment. So like me, she has this homing pigeon instinct and returned back to Michigan. And I have to say, I'm very proud of her as she's now head of the department here and recently elected to the National Academy of Engineering. And I couldn't be more proud.
Well, thank you, Dave. And I will mention, by the way, that I was your second student by 2 weeks. I still regret that. I did not schedule my defense 15 days earlier. That would have been. Then I could have always been the first.
I see.
But still, second is very honorable. I was building on that. When I decided I wanted to do computational material science back in the 1980s, I looked around for a PhD program to do that in, and there were almost no options at all. Fortunately, I talked to Ron Gabala, the department chair here at Michigan, to get a letter of recommendation. And he said, well, we just hired this guy. And I found out, they lured me out to talk with you, and history was made. But the point is that in the 1980s, or 1990s, there wasn't much in the way of computational material science. It was really a niche and specialty area. What made you decide to go into computational science and materials theory, and how do you perceive the growth in that area over the last 30 years?
Very interesting. When I was a graduate student, I think the number of people who were doing computational material science in the U.S., I could probably count on 2 hands, and within probably 2 years of being a graduate student, I knew most of them. And so how did I get into it? When I was a grad student, first thing they have you do is go around and talk to all the faculty members. And it just sounded like the most interesting thing I heard. And I had done an experimental senior thesis, which, by the way, was on liquid helium. And I wondered if I did a PhD in something like that, what would I do with it afterwards? There's not much, there was not much call for it. And by the way, I should throw this in also at this point for all of those people who are wondering what to do with a degree, a PhD degree, is I didn't really know what I wanted to do after I graduated, but there was only one thing I was sure of, is that I did not want to go into academia. And therefore, my first position was in industry. My second position was in a national laboratory. And I ended up going back to university simply because I realized that if I wanted to decide what I do as a researcher, academia is the only way to do it. So that's how I ended up back in academia, despite my better judgment. And I haven't regretted it.
That's good news. I want to follow up with a question about your academic career. People think about academia as a job for life, right? Especially the tenure system in the U.S. and some other places. And they think of it as a job you enter and leave at the same place. You are the counterexample to that stereotype. And so could you tell us a little bit about perhaps the lessons you've learned from your various career transitions and your advice to people who are considering, changes in their career trajectory?
I see. Interesting question. Well, I have to say, I didn't plan all this. At the same time, I was fortunate enough, as you mentioned, to be in an area where there was a very big growing demand for computational material science. And I found that it was relatively easy to be mobile because there was, people were really interested in this field at the time, as now. Um, and when another opportunity came along, I took it because I was always enjoyed going to someplace new, because when you go to someplace new, you meet new people, you hear about new problems, you get to work on new things. And the more I moved, the more I appreciated the benefit of doing that. And I guess I would also say I have a short attention span. So therefore, I didn't mind moving.
It's clear. That's clear.
So, of course, I'm very glad you were at Michigan, because you're probably one of the reasons I came to Michigan, because you introduced me to Ron Kabbalah. And but when I came here, I learned about Larry Van Vlack. And obviously, you didn't come just for this podcast. You're our Van Vlack Lecturer, which is the highest honor that our department gives. And it's about time that we gave it to you. But you knew Larry quite well because he was a faculty member here. And I know when I first got here, I learned all about Larry and what his accomplishments were with his book. But he was also the nicest guy. And he knew everything. He even helped me build a deck because I didn't know if I should put the curvature up or the curvature down. And little did I know at the time I asked him that question that he knew so much about curvature, because his advisor was Cyril Stanley Smith, who sort of invented grand boundaries. And his students were Larry and Bill Mullins, who you later told me Bill Mullins inspired you for much of your career looking at curvature-driven phenomena. So, you just told me you didn't even know that Larry was one of Cyril Stanley Smith's students, or that Bill Mullins was, and that they were his only students. So I'm glad you know that now. But isn't that a strange synergy that you were in the middle of all of that? Did you ever talk to Larry much about curvature-driven phenomena?
Actually, I don't remember ever talking to him about that, which is, I'm sorry I missed the opportunity. By the way, let me just say a little bit about Larry Van Vlack. Besides being the author of the most famous introductory textbook in material science, which went through so many editions, has been translated into so many languages, and I think was the place where most of the people in the world in material science cut their teeth in the subject. I also had the pleasure of teaching Introduction to Material Science with Larry as the very first course I ever taught as a professor. So it was he was quite an inspiration to me. And then you asking me about, what was the other question, about the connection with curvature-driven growth and
right.
and
You
Bill
told me
Mullins?
once that Bill Mullins, you told
Yes.
me once that most theorists react against a previous theorist, and that you've always reacted against not against, but as a result of Bill Mullins' work.
Well, Bill Mullins is one of these professor at Carnegie Mellon University, and I've always had utmost respect for him and his work. And so when I disagreed with Bill, it was nothing personal at all. It was just that the fields evolved. And I have to say that Bill Mullins' work was quite nice because he followed the work, early days in grain growth phenomena, which was inspired by his PhD advisor, Cyril Stanley Smith. And then that work was followed up by one of the most famous mathematicians of the last century, John von Neumann, who was at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. And, John, who's the real mathematician, gave a really elegant statement that just was completely intuitive about how grain growth works, and quite lovely. Actually, one of the most beautiful things in material science, I think. But it turns out that the rigorous version of this same theory actually came from the metallurgist, Bill Mullins, not from the mathematician, von Neumann. And I had the pleasure of working and interacting with Bill over more than a decade, visiting each other and discussing all sorts of things in material science and life. And I think when I knew him, he was probably a little bit younger than I am right now.
And of course, your model of strain-driven morphological transformation ended up being incredibly important in my work with ultrafast laser interaction with materials. I won't go into that, but I do have to thank you very much, because I never would have thought of that. But when I saw it happen, I'm going like, oh my God, this is what Dave said should happen. And sure enough, it really made sense and went beyond optics, because, unlike what a lot of physicists think, the world isn't just physics. Material science plays a lot of roles for a lot of different reasons.
Yeah. Can I comment on that?
Please do.
So the work that Steve is referring to has to do with the fact that if you have a flat surface, and if everything's controlled by surface tension, a flat surface should stay flat. And I realized one morning, where I always do my best work, that wasn't quite the case. And where I do my best work is usually standing in the shower in the morning. That ended up being a very long shower. And it occurred to me that stress plays a role, and stress competes very nicely with curvature in many cases. And in fact, over my career, that same idea keeps popping up in very different circumstances. For the students, I should mention that the interplay of curvature and stress is basically what gives us fracture mechanics. And I was doing this stress-driven surface instability problem, and fracture mechanics just dropped out for free. It was just a consequence. It was a huge surprise to me. But it just shows how all these different things in material science are connected. So the lesson I would say for the students is that understand the basics deeply, and you'll always go back to the same thing again and again and again. And by the way, I learned that from another individual who's also very influential in my career, who was John Kahn, somebody who I've always appreciated the beauty of what he did and the originality of what he did. But John would always go back, and he said, emphasize, think about the basics, always go back to J. Willard Gibbs. And his job was telling everybody what J. Willard Gibbs would have said if he was there.
And John was very successful at doing that.
And he was.
And you have as well. I love how you bring back the different threads that pull your work together. You've made significant contributions in a number of different areas in material science, using those basics, I guess, and very, very, very well. And you've made those contributions with a wide variety of collaborators too. There are some scientific, some scientists who choose a collaboration and stay. Some scientists who never collaborate. But you're the third. You collaborate widely, worldwide, across disciplines with many, many different people. What makes a successful scientific collaboration, and how do you find the right one, and how do you make the most of it?
I wish I knew the answer to that question.
You clearly do know the answer because you practice it, but perhaps articulate.
I guess it has to do with just curiosity and the desire to solve a problem and not care about how you solve it. And there also has to be an openness to other points of view. I mean, it may come as a surprise to other material scientists and engineers, is that I would say probably a third of my collaborations have been with mathematicians. And why did I work with mathematicians? Well, it's because they were able to do things that I wanted to do, but was unable to do. And the main thing you want in a collaboration is not somebody like yourself. You want somebody who's different enough, but has close enough that you can actually have a conversation. I remember years ago working with a theoretical physicist. We were talking about dislocations, and it took a year of conversation with him to get him to understand what I consider very basic things, and the other way around. So we spent a year learning how to communicate. And then we wrote a few papers together, and turned out to be very good. And so, like I said, I just open to the idea of working with whoever you need in order to solve a problem. I like to, you've probably all heard the story about a hammer and a nail. You don't want to have a hammer such that every problem looks like a nail. What you want is to have a full toolbox, and when you're missing a tool, go find the guy who has it. So that's sort of the approach that I take, and I guess I'm loud enough and bother people enough that they figure if they're going to get rid of me, they better talk to me now and get it over with.
Somehow I don't think that's exactly their thought process, but understood. Steve.
So, of course, this is a materials education podcast, and you've been central to helping me learn how to be a professor since I took over your course, the MSc 400, which way back when was really like our 242. It was our quantum mechanics course, solid state physics, but you gave me your notes so that I could teach that course, and it was amazing. Your notes were fantastic. And I had learned it at Penn with Bill Graham, and he was pretty good at it too, but you added such a distinct spin to it, putting in all the stat mech into it and making people understand what a Fermi-Dirac distribution was. So I learned so much by doing those notes. But then you gave me the most amazing gift of all. You gave me the homework solutions. And you told me, these are great. I didn't do them. My student did these. It was Liz. Liz had done all the homework solutions.
I was the TA for that class.
Yes, and so that was very beneficial. But I digress. You're now a dean. You've been a dean several times. You clearly think a lot about education because that's a prime directive. So now that you're an administrator, how do you support faculty in taking advantage of technology and new pedagogies? Do you encourage them to do that? How do you make that happen from up above? Because we all know the best solutions are grassroots solutions. The worst solutions are top down. But as an administrator, you're kind of stuck. If there's not a grassroots, you better start to pull. So how do you deal with that?
Right. Pull it up instead of pushing it out. Yeah. I think it's an interesting thing, and I think it's not easy. As a dean, my job is really to help the faculty do what it wants to do, which for most professors is often very heavily on the research side. But one of the consequences of that is sometimes professors don't think enough about the pedagogy, and a lot of us want to teach the way we were taught. And to start over and learn how to do new things when you could be spending your time going into the lab is not always so easy. So what I try to do is, I try to make sure that faculty are aware of what the opportunities are to learn how to change their pedagogy approaches. I don't tell them what they should do, because probably the people who could tell them what to do are much better at it than I am. Second thing is I try to influence the curriculum to try to do two things today. One is make sure that students who come to do engineering don't forget why they wanted to be engineers. And so why do people want to be engineers as secondary school students? Usually it's because they want to be a mechanical engineer because they like cars and airplanes. If they want to be an electrical engineer, is they like gadgets. And so what I'm trying to do right now is increase the amount of hands-on experiences from the very first day they get on campus, and make sure that that goes all the way through their education. So that's one thing. The second thing is to think about where the field is going and try to make sure that the curriculum stays ahead of it. So right now at the University of Hong Kong, we've now instituted mandatory AI courses, plural, for every student, whether you're an engineer or a music student or a philosophy student, that goes all the way through. And so we do it as a university requirement, but we also do it as a faculty of engineering requirement, and then every department does it. And my job is to make sure that the right people and the right resources are in place. And I have to twist some arms about the little question of, all engineering professors think there's not enough time to teach the engineering that they need to teach for their subject. So to get them to give up some time for more hands-on things and more AI kinds of things is not always so easy. But my job is to convince people that it's the right thing to do. And usually faculty are pretty receptive to that. They see the future coming.
Well, in fact, I don't expect anyone to have a perfect prognostication about this, but where do you see that future going? Where do you think the AI quote unquote revolution might be leading in science and engineering?
Well, I wish I knew the answer to that question.
We're just getting this on tape so
Yes.
we can 10 years from
10
now see
years
how
from
close
now,
you got. So, yeah.
Well, I mean, first of all, I think, we should not be afraid of it. And, people are always talking now about, it's going to take everybody's jobs away. It's going to be the end of civilization as we know it. The point is, it will change everything. And I would say, in engineering, we really ought to be very open to that. I look at AI as a tool. And as a tool, whoever's the best at using the tool will have the best future in terms of employability, impact, progress, all that. Now, if you want to ask me where AI is going, that's even a more fun question. For all the AI experts who may be listening, please close your ears because I will tell you what I think about it. Actually, you look at large language models today, and I'd say it's amazing how fast they're changing and evolving. People talk about going towards a general intelligence. which is quite an interesting idea. I'm not sure I buy into it 100%, but I was talking to one of the leaders at NVIDIA not that long ago, and who was a firm believer in we're just a few years away from general intelligence. But here's the question I've been thinking about. Sorry, I hope you don't mind.
Please do. I want to hear this.
So I look at how we train AIs today. You feed it all the data you could possibly find to give it to it as a training set. And you invest power plants worth of electricity and huge amounts of resources to training a model. Now, let's look at another side. If you look at a toddler, I know how much energy the toddler consumes because I know how much I fed it. And I know how much data it has because I know how many hours a day it's been awake and interacting with the world. The difference between the two is the toddler grows in a couple of years, acquires language, learns how to interact with the world. And I think that's what's missing in AI today, is that an infant, sees a glass here in the beginning, will try to grab it, completely unable to grab it. But after a few months, it learns how to do that. Why is that? It's because an infant, unlike an AI, has sensors and actuators. It's got hands, it's got eyes, got ears, it has touch, and it does experiments. And it does the experiments itself, and it learns from the experiments it does. I think that's what's missing today in how we train AIs. And I think there's a big opportunity in this area people call physical AI, in embedding is putting something physical into the system. Because the human brain is not just a computer. It drives and senses. And if we really want to develop a useful intelligence, it can't just know a lot of things. It's got to be able to do something with it. And the ability to do experiments, I think, is the key.
Have you ever watched a robot hand
Yes.
learn how to catch something?
Yeah.
It's just what you described. And they do it. They miss, they miss, they miss. Then they start to be, because they have cameras, they have actuators, and they have a brain. And they learn, you watch them learning, and it's just like you described. But they're doing this in robotics.
With the AI-driven robotics now, yeah.
Well, I saw them doing this before I even heard the word AI.
I see.
And this is all just machine learning.
Yeah, right. I was recently at the World Robotics Congress, whatever it is, in Beijing a few months ago. And I saw about 50 companies that are developing humanoid robots. And you can see them do amazing things now because they are putting together with AI, and I think that's an important thing. I think, though, there was something they're missing, though. Don't tell Elon Musk. But I think what we want in robots, just like I want in collaborators, is I don't want a robot who's like me, who does what I do. I don't want a humanoid robot. I want robots who do things that people can't do. And I think that a lot of what you're seeing now in humanoid robot development, I think there will be a role for it, but it's not the major role, and it's not the major thing in robotics. And I think as time goes on, a lot of those 50 companies that I saw doing all these wonderful, wonderful humanoid robots, I think in just a few years, there will only be a few companies left standing. No pun intended.
One of the faculty members in our department, Wenhao Sun, did a podcast with us showing us how he uses vibe coding with AI to have thermodynamics students solve much harder problems than we normally give them But to do that, they have to really understand thermodynamics because AI is pretty stupid about it. And he makes the point, in the middle of talking to us, he said, it's kind of weird. When I talk to ChatGPT, it's kind of like talking to my graduate students because they've read everything and they know everything. They just don't know what it means. And that's an opportunity to do something. And of course, AI is like having 100,000 or 1,000,000 graduate students with all the data, but they really don't know what it means. And that's where the human comes in. So I like that attitude.
Just to that point, we've been developing an AI platform, which I like to call the AI graduate student. And the way it works is as follows. We give it a problem, a question. You tell it, go out and read the literature. Come back and propose something interesting to do that's a way of approaching this question that people haven't really looked at before or not looked at seriously before. So then what it does is you say, okay, I'll tell you, I as the professor will then tell which one to go after. It then goes out and looks for software packages that can do this sort of thing. It writes the Python code to run those software packages. It runs them using untold hours of computer time. It generates results, which, just like the graduate students' first experiments, are usually not very good. And, but we get it to take the data, plot the data, analyze the data, and then ask it, did you answer the question? And if the answer is no, then you say, okay, go back and do it again. So, I think in the beginning, it's better than a graduate student. The difference is graduate students get better much faster than it does. Right. So, I wouldn't trade my graduate students for more GPUs yet.
But also, graduate students do something AI doesn't do. It learns from the experience of interacting with you as a human being so that it can actually replicate you. And our graduate students can then go on and teach educate a whole army of graduate students. And AI can't do that.
So, interesting question. So, as Liz Holm knows, often when a student writes their first paper, I will sit with them at the front of the computer the first time they write a paper and edit my way through along with the student. So my students look at that and they said to me, okay, I have to learn how to write better. So they gave it 300 papers I wrote and retrained the AI to write like me. I've got clever students. And it turns out that it actually does sound like me, but it doesn't really write better. It just sounds like me.
It's as if it learned the accent as opposed to the content.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
But that is something to be proud of, that you have a corpus of work that is sufficient to train an AI to a good level of sounding like you. So,
if not me, then. Yes.
So with this is a wonderful, wide-ranging conversation about where we are and where we've been. I'd like to ask, what is your next step? Where are you going in this new wilderness, this new AI populated wilderness?
I see. That's a good question. If you asked me that 6 months ago, I have no idea I'd be where I am now. Because AI is changing so rapidly. I'll tell you two things we're doing right now, because I'd say we're just starting and I think there's a future to it. One of the things we'll do is ask the AI to design a material that has a certain set of properties. And what it'll do is go out, do literature search, and we can train it on that for a lot of materials and say, find a material that matches these things. Well, if you have a lot of data, there's a lot of interpolation and all that going in there. But it seems to work pretty well, but, you know, not all the materials it comes up with are actually practical materials. You know, like, you know, alloy with 17 components, most of which are rare earths, and which nobody could make even if they tried. At the same time, you can now, with AI, you can query it and say, why did you pick that? Why did you make it like that? Okay, so that's one thing we're trying to do right now, is do interpretable AI for trying to understand how it makes materials choices. Second thing we're doing now, I like to refer to this as training a theorist AI, is, you know, I say, well, tell me about, say, you know, take a metallic glass, and I want to know whether a particular material, I can make a glass out of it. So you give it a database of all these things. You give it people who made glasses, and it trains on that. And then you say, well, first thing is I want to know is what variables should I be looking at if I want to come up with a theory for glass formability? And so it goes through the literature and says, well, I need to know, like, what's the recrystallization temperature, what's the melting point, etc. So you go through, and it will pick out several parameters that it thinks is important based on the literature. Then you say, okay, well, if I have all these variables, how do I combine them so that it gives me a formula that fits the data really well? And at the end of the day, it will give me a formula. But then I say, well, that formula is too complicated. You know, it's got too many terms. It's really quite ugly. And by the way, a theory that's beautiful is worth a lot. At least to me, I put beauty as a very high priority in theory. And so I tell it, don't make it too complicated. So we penalize things for getting too ugly. And then at the end, you end up with a very simple formula. And then you ask it, what does that mean? And the interesting thing is it came up with quite a good explanation of, you know, talking about things in terms of supercooling versus crystallization and trying to balance the competition between those two terms. And it really came up with that all by itself. And I say, wow, I wouldn't have thought of that equation. I probably would have come up with something similar, but I wouldn't have thought of that equation. And then if you look in the literature, it's not one of the formulas that already exist, and it does better than any of the existing formulas. and it did that. You know, will it work for everything? I'm sure it won't. Now, why is that important? Because it's just interpolating the results and maybe trying to explain it to me. But as a theorist, you know, I'm always very happy to have hints about what's the right way to go. And if the AI can keep me from going down some dead ends, making some wrong terms, you know, that's what I want. I want somebody to be my assistant and help me stay on the right path. So I think that's an example.
It sounds like a great use of AI, a great tool for what you're doing. I am thrilled to hear that AI is making inroads even in theory. I do have to ask the question: if the AI came up with this model, this theory that is new to the world and does better than the current theories, what would happen if I prompted it to do the same things? Would it come up with the same theory, or would it come up with an equally good different theory? How and what does that tell us about the uniqueness of underlying truth in the physical world?
Wow, that's a very philosophical question. Uniqueness is a very high standard, and truth is a very high standard. I think as theorists, we're looking for a good answer.
Yes.
I think looking for the best answer. There's not much mileage in that. I'd rather have a really good answer soon than a perfect answer later. But I agree with you. Truth and beauty and uniqueness are all desirable. I don't know how to teach an AI that.
But I mean, AI gives us a hope of actually exploring, as it were, the phase space of answers. Right?
Yes, exactly.
And
That's
I
the
think
right way to look at it.
That's really interesting. And some of what we learn is not just the answers themselves, but the fact that there isn't just one right best answer. And now we have to think about how we think about our answers. And
Yes.
I love that aspect. So.
Right. No, good point. Good point.
I like that you asked it, what does it mean? So many theories don't mean anything.
What do you mean? All theorists.
I'm thinking of like the movement in physics, the universality classes, KPZ theory, for example. None of those terms meant anything. They were not physical. They were just curve fitting. And to ask AI to explain what it means physically, we're as humans, we demand that there be mechanisms that drive nature. Otherwise, we can't understand it. We can't put it into context.
Yeah, excellent point. I would say that if you look at critical phenomena, that you were just talking about, things like KPZ theory, those kinds of theories themselves are quite beautiful because they don't know, the people developing them don't know what underlying mechanisms are. But what they do is they include things like the lowest order terms that are not forbidden by symmetry. And if you have those sort of mathematical principles, just to quote, I forget the guy's name from Jurassic Park, nature will find a way. And it turns out in some of those kinds of theories, it wasn't until much later that we found the mechanism that was consistent with the theory, even though if you asked me what the mechanism was, I would never have thought of it before the theory existed. So the underlying mathematical structure of the universe is a very high principle, and it's more clever than I am. I was going to say we are, but I don't want to imply.
I heard a great talk by a theorist of physics, particle physicist, talking about time reversal and parity.
Yes.
And there were big problems, and everyone said, you can't write this Hamiltonian because it's not Hermitian. And this guy thought about it. He goes, wait a minute. We know this thing because of physics. We know this thing because of physics. But this part, that's from mathematics. So why should we listen to it? So he allowed it. And all of a sudden, it broke all the theory because it was much closer to reality. So It doesn't always work.
Yeah. But, it sort of reminds me of some famous stories about Richard Feynman. And he was famous for not doing mathematics. Although I would have to say he had a mathematical intuition that was much better than many of the people who were doing the mathematics. And I think, and that even he would agree that these sort of mathematical principles are like these physics principles are much more important than understanding things like mechanism and things like that, because in the end, you'll find the mechanism that's consistent. It's just that we don't know what it is yet. And so it means we miss something.
Yes. And so we don't miss something else because you're on a tight schedule. Sadly, we're going to have to stop. So I wanted to thank you so much, Dave. But we always ask our guest, is there anything you'd like to add? And you certainly should send me links to your institution, to your work, so we can put it in the show notes. But is there anything else we forgot that you'd like to add?
I guess I would just add that, I got into material science, as I mentioned in the beginning, sort of by accident for all the wrong reasons. At the same time, I feel very fortunate that I did. And I would say I can't think of a more exciting field even after all these years. And so if you're considering what to do in engineering, material scientist is sort of the enabler of every other technology. And so if you really want to get down to the basic stuff, materials is the right stuff.
Fantastic. And with that, thank you so much. And thank you for listening to all of our listeners. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Dave.
Yeah.